Hi, my name is Claire L. Evans, and I'm one-third of the band Yacht, Young Americans Challenging High Technology. You're listening to the Computer Accent Podcast, a series where we share fascinating conversations about art, artificial intelligence, and the future of music. We started filming our documentary, The Computer Accent, at the beginning of 2017. For several years, we traveled around the U.S. talking to research scientists, coders, curators, and artists who are working with AI. In the documentary, as in all documentaries, you only get to see key fragments of those conversations. But we want to share them with you in more depth, because meeting these people totally changed the way we think about making music. Today, we're kicking off the series with one of the most interesting, poetic, and wide-ranging conversations of our time making this film. In November of 2017, we drove up to Santa Cruz to meet with David Cope, an emeritus professor of music at UC Santa Cruz and one of the early pioneers of algorithmic composition. In the early 80s, Cope created Experiments in Musical Intelligence, or EMI, an AI program capable of analyzing and recombining fragments of music from a database into wholly original compositions in the style of the original pieces. So EMI, quite famously, and controversially, produced new compositions by Beethoven, Mozart, and Stravinsky, which enraged the classical music community and sparked a conversation about the legitimacy of AI-created music that we're still having today. Cope met us upstairs in his study, where every single square inch of the ceiling was covered in wind chimes.
My name is David Cope, and I've been a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, oh my goodness, since my late 30s. That would put me somewhere about, well, it's been 40 years or so, and before that at various other universities. I'm a pianist, a cellist, percussionist, a conductor, a few other instruments. I like that. I like playing. I'm a composer. I'm also an algorithmic composer. I love artificial intelligence. I'm a programmer. I'm a novelist of 25 novels, and I'm a visual artist. But even though I took art for 7 years in my youth, or was forced to, I am fundamentally, my art is non-touching. Although I really do enjoy, sticks and cans of house paint and large, very large sheets in which I pretend that I've got the talent of one of my favorite artists, which is Mr. Jackson Pollock. I'll announce him.
You're also a wind chime collector, clearly.
I'm a wind chime collector.
Mm-hmm. Where did that start?
It started maybe 35 years ago, I guess, all in all, if I think about it.
Is there a relationship between the wind chimes and the algorithmic music? The
Absolutely.
Sort of aleatoric
These are
effect?
physical algorithms. In other words, they can't play a note that isn't in amongst the 5 or 6 or 7 chimes that are present. All they can do is change with the wind. And you can see this room is filled with windows that can open. So I sometimes do, and I listen to the wind scatter through my wind chimes, making constantly different sounds. And it's wonderful. And it's wonderful music.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been doing algorithms since I was 7. This just simply means I write down a piece I'm going to write or compose, or a book or a poem or whatever, without actually doing the poem first. But I'm drawing out a storyboard of my work, of my novel, of my poem or short story or work of art that I want to create. And it helps me follow through on it, but doesn't necessarily bind me into finishing it exactly the way I planned it when I started. Mm-hmm. And that all started with a story that's very important to my life that I've told many times. And if I'm telling it to you now, and you've seen it before, then maybe you've heard me say it before. But basically, I'm an acrophobic, fear of heights kind of person. And my mother, bless her heart, was someone who liked to advise me about things. And she had read in I believe it was Saturday Evening Post or one of the magazines back in the 50s. And in that article, she read that the way to really stop your phobias from continuing the rest of your life was to confront them directly. Well, we happened to live in a house that was right across the street from KPHO Radio's 4 humongous 150-foot towers that were lit up all night. And I used to watch them because their lights flashing 3 per tower were such that they never were in the same rhythm exactly. So I could just sort of rhythmically cheat and borrow some things from them as they did it at night. But anyway, one night I was out pretending that I was doing some astronomy, building a telescope or something, and I decided it was the night. So after they went to bed, 11, 11:30, 12, somewhere in there, I walked across the street through a cotton field and across another couple of streets and then into the desert where we lived, and went up to the first of these standing things, which was about a quarter of a mile away. And it was one of these kinds of antennas which was no more than 1.33 feet or maybe 1.5 feet. And it went up all the way that way, all those feet, and was held in place by a bulb that was less than the diameter of the tower itself, and held in place by these taut wires. And you have to imagine that they had to be pretty taut to be able to do that. And I said, I'm going to do this. So what if it's midnight? I'm going to climb to the top. So I climbed to the top and fell and died. No.
I knew it was going there.
I climbed to the top. I promised myself I wouldn't look down and didn't look down. I waited till I got to the top to do that and realized immediately with this one red light blinking constantly in my face that I couldn't get down. There was no way I could get down. And that I would probably just fall off when I fell asleep sometime during the night and that my days were numbered. And this is absolutely true. And I just stayed up there for I don't know how long, but quite a long time. Even though it was Phoenix, and in the summertime, it gets kind of cold at 1 and 2 in the morning. But I was up there for maybe 3 hours. And then something happened. The wind came up, a gentle wind, but nonetheless a wind, and blew through these taut wires, like wires on a violin, it occurred to me. And they started singing to me. And I said, oh my God. Probably because I knew I was going to die, I just thought those were the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. They were just fabulous. I said, I've got to get down so I didn't think of it in terms of algorithms. I didn't even know the word at the time, but I knew that I had to get down and write this down in some way. And so I did. That's simple. I just didn't look down, and I just climbed down, and I concentrated only on staying on that tower the whole way, listening to it, first of all, right around me, and then slowly it went up into the rafters as I came down, got on the ground, ran home, found an envelope that had been used but opened and the contents taken out. So I turned it over, and like I guess Lincoln, I started to draw and write in various informations that I knew I would need to actually compose that piece when I had the resources to do so. I had to have sounds like the wires, so I spent maybe then part of the next week just stretching wires as tight as I could make them across wood platforms and so forth, and then trying to get them to sing like that. But I had a hell of a time, and so I finally went on to other things. It took me maybe 20 years before I came against electronic sound-making devices called synthesizers, and so I couldn't afford to buy one of those. My wife and I had just gotten married, and we had our first son on the way already. We didn't even know it was a son, and so I let it go, and then I waited until 2001, and at that particular point, computers were making sound, beautiful sounds, and so I realized the piece for the first time, and we performed it at the university here. But that cemented, something. And 10 years later, I gave it a name, algorithm, out of the sciences. And I was doing algorithmic music, and I knew it. And of course, I was going to art school at the time, so I decided I was going to do algorithmic everything. And in fact, I was an algorithm, and you are, and you will be, and it's all, everything around us is an algorithm. And so I knew that by then. I'd figured it out. I read George Gamow, who was a very famous scientist who wrote books about, Einstein's theories and so forth. And he used the word in his books. I had a whole stack of his books. They were really great. And I studied those, and this word algorithm kept popping out, and so that's how I use it.
So algorithmic music saved your life?
It did. I had never thought of it that way. I was writing a book called New Music Composition. Surprisingly enough, this was in '75. I just received an email from somebody who said it saved my life. It just made me open my eyes to what music could be. So wow. I don't usually get things like, that book went in print and out of print within 2 months. And it was out of print by anger and by frustration, because it's all about experimental music. So
when you first started working with computers, was there something in your mind that you wanted to hear that you couldn't hear from traditional instruments?
Well, remember, I didn't go into it for the sounds it made. I went into it from the composing point of view. What were the order of the sounds that I liked? What was it going to make this certain kind of melody or this certain kind of whatever? I was interested in that aspect of it more than I was making, strange sounds. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, for example, that was EMI produced, and not my EMI. My EMI came from Experiments in Musical Intelligence, which is more or less of an umbrella. It was not the name of a program, but it became that eventually. But it just became what I was interested in. And so I tried all kinds of things. And then in 1980, when I was here, I got a commission to do a piece and had a composer's block. And as a result, I had to do something because I had a deadline, which I eventually missed anyway, but I didn't know that at that particular time. And so I just figured if I called it something highfalutin like Experiments in Musical Intelligence, wow, that would really ring in people's ears. So I did that, and then tried all sorts of things to do a operatic composition in my style with the computer doing all the work. And I eventually, 8 years later, got it. And it took about 25 minutes, to be honest, to create the entire opera. But I still had those 8 years
Yeah.
previous where I was doing all manner of things, including figuring out a way, since I couldn't figure out what my style was exactly, finding out what the style of Bach was all about, and then trying to program it first, and then exchange the Bach database for a Cope database, and off and running I went.
How do you teach Bach to a program?
I don't teach it. It teaches itself.
Okay.
The idea was that if you're going to learn a style of anything, how to paint a certain picture, how to make a certain dish, if you're a cook, I mean, these are all creative things that one does. And what would you do? Well, if under the best of circumstances, you'd find the dish that you like the best, the enchilada recipe that you like the best. And you'd probably make a couple or have somebody else make them or ask somebody in a restaurant how they made theirs because you liked it so much, and you'd take that and you would, seriously consider it, ask for more information. And a recipe is an algorithm, and that's what most people call an algorithm. They define it as a recipe for getting some things done. So you're following an algorithm. Now, how do you translate a recipe in the kitchen to a recipe for creating Bach? And that's, you've got to have some Bach. So I decided I wasn't going to do, after some mistakes along the way, I decided what I was going to do was make a database full of Bach. And then I was going to have this rather small analytical program that was going to sit on top of all this Bach and analyze it in the right way, and then use that analysis to compose new Bach, which sounded like the style of the Bach in the database, but wasn't exactly any one of those things. And I call that recombination, and I've used it for a lot of different programs since. But I am really a person who gets fixated on something. And when I do, I'm going to do it if it kills me. I don't care what else happens. And my wife will attest to that.
So originally you created this program in order to compose original music of your own, not to recombine Bach, but you had to go through the Bach process to get to the Cope process?
Exactly.
So what I'm curious is, I find sometimes, for example, like when you learn a new language, you end up learning a lot more about English because you realize what the subjunctive is and all these invisible pieces. So I'm curious to know what you learned about music or about your own compositional style.
Well, I learned what I already knew but was pretending it wasn't the case. I learned that, like every other composer in history, I steal. I don't borrow. I steal from other people. I just do. That's where we get it from. And if you want to ask me about the first composer in the history of the world, what did he or she do? Well, there's birds out there. So you probably take the mockingbird with lots of varieties.
Yeah.
You ever listen to a mockingbird? There's a perfect example of theft. I mean, they work at it and practice and practice. And I love to listen to mockingbirds practice. They do great. So, I learned firsthand when I heard a piece of mine created by the computer, the opera. I learned that there were certain composers I really liked, and I listened to their music a lot. They were contemporary composers, and I had been stealing from them, but not in a way that people would recognize. That's what I was trying to do. That's the difference between stealing and borrowing. If you're borrowing it, then you recognize it, and it's what's that word academics use all the time? Appropriate.
Appropriation.
Appropriate. And I didn't want to appropriate. I wanted to be the composer who used it in original ways. So, Mozart didn't appropriate his music from Haydn. He stole it, not borrowed it. Does that answer your?
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
Were you disappointed in that and finding out those things about yourself? Really? Why?
I thought I was original. I thought I really did. I mean, I knew about Stravinsky's quote, of all things, about good composers borrow, great composers steal. This is what it was.
That was another question we had, though, about how the computer wouldn't take into account physicality. So did they ever compose something that humans couldn't play with it, like physically?
Absolutely.
And what happens then? Do they try first?
No. But yeah, it was both an enthralling and a disappointing kind of process that I went through for about 15 years, actually.
Disappointing how?
Well, in discovering my style was
No one likes looking in a mirror,
borrowed. Yeah.
unless you're a psychopath.
I would love to know about just the response to this kind of output. People gave you a hard time?
Oh, in the early days, oh, God, yes. It was incredible. In
Death
fact,
threats?
I had 2 stalkers at one time.
Wow.
And we were actually a little fearful of me to actually drive up to school to teach.
Wow.
That somebody might have a rifle across the street.
Wow.
People that were just hardcore classicists and Puritans about music?
No, I don't think these were thinkable. These people were just, it was more...
Luddites?
Nah, well, I'm sure that was part of it. But they were people who either lost a job via the fact that a computer was taking over that job, or people who thought that was going to happen in the future. I mean, it was all economic or power plays or something. Most of it had very little, at that time, very little musical problems. I mean, after all, the music is classical music and not pop music. There was none of that. Well, there was some of that, but none of it got to the public because I was told by a lawyer that I was going to be the first person sued for imitating a group's style.
Were people offended by the idea that someone would deign to try to create new Bach, for example?
No. They were all afraid that I was sticking my nose where it didn't belong. That is, creativity is something humans can do, but machines cannot, or should not, or may not, or whatever. And it was, that was all new to me. It never occurred to me that scientific inquiry is something that that is not based on human kinds of strange needs. I mean, most people think that in fact creativity, like soul, S-O-U-L, is something that human beings and only human beings have, the ability to do that. So it was a compliment to me that they were mad because it meant that what I was doing was probably pretty good. But they got very mad. They got extremely mad. And yes, there were times in which I was sure somebody was going to punch me or so forth. And I'm actually pretty good at that sort of stuff. Well, okay, let me give you an example. One person was fighting me because they said that I was taking away something that humans not only owned, but that made them great. We had this stuff that couldn't be copied by machines. And now I was trying to do it. So I was lessening the value of a human being. And I kept saying, from what I considered a scientific viewpoint, no, you're not only wrong, you're absolutely wrong. And the reason is, if you tell me that we're strong, we're mentally strong, and can't do something, then that makes us weak, not stronger. So what if I give a soul to a computer or to a machine? What if I give it creativity? I gift it the right to be able to do this sort of thing. That doesn't make us weaker. That makes us stronger. That makes us better. Makes us what you want us to be. But if I say we can't do that, that makes us weaker.
Right.
Well, it's kind of a meta creativity, right? I mean, there's the difference between creating a piece of music just alone with a pad of paper or an instrument, and then there's creating something that can create music. It's like one step farther away.
Yes.
But in a way, I don't know,
It's just as beautiful to me.
It's a factor, it's a magnitude more creative, right?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay, good. If
That's not new.
That newer,
Yeah.
I suppose.
No, it's not even that. There are other things that are newer.
Right.
But I had been thinking before that of something, because of people who had listened to it, who actually had some brains and were a little bit more, let's say, liberal in their thinking about this, that it would be interesting to write a program that worked on the opposite principles of Emmy, and that is, instead of writing music in the style of somebody, to write music that was out of the style of everybody, a new style of music. And that came to me over a period of a couple of years, how I would do that. And the way in which I did it was I first of all made Emily Howell, which, by the way, is Emily is a form of Emmy, and Howell is my middle name and my father's first name. And my family situation at home when I was very young was, what's the word they use that I forget on purpose? Dysfunctional? Yeah, that's the word. And it was very simple to say who was doing what to whom, because my mother was vicious, and my father was the kindest man in the world. And in my father's eyes, I could do no wrong. In my mother's eyes, I could do no right. So she used to beat me up when he wasn't home, which is fine. But nothing I could do would please her. In my father's eyes, he said, anything you do, you're my son, and I love you, and it's great. And I'll back you up 100%. And they stayed together somehow. I don't know how that actually worked, but they stayed together. But it's my mother who did me the biggest favor of all that. She without knowing it, I mean, she didn't do it on purpose. Without knowing it, she made me feel so small and undistinguishable from vermin in the backyard that I could take anything. I mean, I could literally take anything. And that was good because, I was coming up against a career that I didn't know of at the time that was going to make me have to take literally anything.
Yeah.
And it never bothered me. In fact, I loved it. And then, and so I owe her, a big favor. In fact, I owe my family a big favor back then. I think every creator should have at least a sampling of that kind of being brought up in that kind of weird, very strange, completely
Brutal.
brutal. But I didn't tell you that I actually mentally sort of not convinced myself, because this is all playland, but I pretended that Emily Howell was the daughter of Emmy. So as life would have it, Emmy gave all of her music to Emily to use for her database. Now, her music was in the style of Chopin, Bach, Vivaldi, I mean, all these composers up through Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky, composers in a couple of places were even still living. Lots, I mean, a huge amount of music, good God, probably 25 hours of music, at least 1,000 pieces. And she started composing. She or me, I talked to her. I mean, clearly I talked to her. In fact, when I begin using her, I use language, and she doesn't know any language, so I can use anything. I can use, made-up languages. I can make up a language that day and start talking to her. But I got to remember what the words mean. But I mean, when I create a piece that way, it gets to the point where I really think that I'm talking to somebody's actually there, and I know that they're not there. I'm okay.
Did she ever tell you jokes?
No.
Not even musically?
Not even musically. Oh, yeah, well, there are some funny things that come out, but I don't think that's with her knowledge particularly. And she has no soul.
Yet.
But then again, I don't even know if I don't even know what soul is. Yeah. Neither does the dictionary. So I'm not alone in this. Yeah. Soul is just a soulless thing that's flying around. I mean, we don't know what it is. It takes so long to write and to work with for a while that by the time I finish and I'm ready to produce something, all the systemware, all the hardware is completely out of date. It's completely out of date. Nobody has those things anymore. So I could give them away and they'd go, God, I got to go out and buy one of those and go to the garage sales around and stuff. And, garage sales is hard to find a system floating around someplace. System 9, I see it over there, So it became very clear when I mothballed, as I call it, Emmy in 2004. By 2006, 2 years later, nothing would run it. And the language I use is a typical AI language. It's Lisp, and it's an AI language, and still is an AI language. John McCarthy invented it at MIT, and then he ended up at Stanford. And one day at lunch, I was having lunch with some of the people at Stanford that I know, and John McCarthy was sitting about 3 tables away by himself. Nobody would sit with him because he was pretty crusty. I had met him before, but not under those circumstances. And everybody at the table was daring me to go over and talk to this man who was, at least 20 years my senior, with a long white hair and a braid down to his waist. And here he was, 80 in his early 80s, and he was reading a book, very heavy science books, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. It influenced my life so much. I would say, coming from left field,
yes, great,
that a computer is a tool. That's all it is. That's all it is. It's a tool. You wouldn't drive down the street and see a guy out in front digging a hole with a shovel and say, look at that shovel, my God, look what it's doing. It's digging that hole. Well, that's just absurd. And we're doing this with computers because we don't know how they run, or a lot of people don't know how they run. When all they do is add. They don't even subtract. They have to have software to subtract. You just add a positive and a negative number together, right? And you can create multiplication and division through that, and you can eventually get up to to all manner of calculus and other things going on. So, but it's still just that addition at the bottom. It's very, very, very simple and crude. And if you want to go look at HAL in 2001 and imagine that's what the computer you have in your bedroom with you tonight, and you want to keep a light on just to make sure it isn't going to get up and walk over and hit you with a hammer. That's all it is. I'm not putting them down for being tools. I'm building them up. Mm-hmm. I'd love to have an implant. Before I die, I'd love to have implants all over my head. Everybody who made horse and buggy items in the blacksmith shops were out of business in 10 years. And they were just being asked, okay, if you want to make a living, you'll make even a better living if you learn how to do this, and we'll teach you how to do this. One of the things that's so incredible about algorithmic music is that if you want and you get this idea, I wonder how this would sound if I had these 20 instruments going together in this way that I know nobody's ever done before. Oh my God, I can't do that because it would take me 6 weeks to write down a piece that would have those in it, and then I'd only have 3 or 4 seconds of music. Mm-hmm. But if you were a programmer and could do this, bang, you could have it that afternoon. And you could say, oh, that works. I really like that. And not only that, I'm going to write my pieces on this machine, and it'll turn out the pieces as I want them. If I don't like it, I'll change it by hand or by something, or I'll write a new one, for heaven's sakes, or I'll write 10,000 new ones. How can you lose? It's to the benefit of everybody. It's all good news. I thought it was going to change within 10 years. It hasn't changed, and it's just beginning to change in the last year. Mm-hmm. It's starting, people are really getting, and it's really interesting to see them all sound like they're the first to get the idea.
Yeah. How does that make you feel?
It doesn't make me feel like anything. Art for art's sake is exactly the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Fuck the rest.